Okay, picking up where we left off, we just finished talking about Microsoft Update and what its limitations are and what its purposes are. That would be a good question. The next handful are all talking about our exercise we did in Microsoft Word. We went in and we made a technical document. We recall we went in and we did some cool styles and things of that nature. So I'm going to ask you, like, what are the options for doing styles? If you recall, we did it in two different ways in that example. Talking about headers and footers, and again, nothing really technical. I'm going to ask you, how do you do it, or, where do you go to get it, and, those kinds of things. I'm not going to ask you to do one, for example. I'm just going to ask you a little bit about it. The next one talks about how to do citations. For example, we were, in this exercise, we were pretending like we were doing an APA paper. So I'm going to ask you some questions about how that worked, how we built that source and how we inserted a citation in the document and how we had a bibliography at the end. I'm going to ask you some questions about the mechanics of actually how that part works. Search and replace, I'm going to ask you some questions on how that works. How do you get to search and replace? Perhaps something like the shortcuts and things of that nature. So how to make search and replace work and how to get there. I made a comment about clip art. About how if you use Microsoft Word to perform the search, or you click on their little link that goes out to the internet and gets clip art, then there's something that it's providing to you that's slightly different than if you just went directly to the internet and typed in clip art. So if you know the difference between doing it from inside Microsoft Word and then doing it directly from the internet, you won't have any troubles with this question. Doing an APA table. The tables in APA are kind of weird, and I'm going to ask you just some little factoids, so to speak, about what does an APA table look like, for example. A very simple question. Okay, the next one talks about, now we're in Chapter 5, and Chapter 5 is all about, the risks. Remember we talked about how there's really multiple categories of risk, and the textbook really only talked about bad guys and Mother Nature. They actually didn't talk about the third category that we discussed in lecture. So, you might want to rewind and take a look at that lecture one more time. Denial of service. I'm going to ask you a little bit about how it works, or perhaps what systems they employ to create a denial of service, or what is a denial of service, and how does that impact businesses, things of that nature. The next one talks about kind of the difference between unauthorized access versus unauthorized use. You remember how I mentioned that, unauthorized access is pretty simple. You gained access to something that you shouldn't have. Okay, that's kind of simple. But the other one's a little more complex. And it often applies to system administrators who have the authority, but have a policy that tells them don't do that. So one is, I don't have the authority, but I gained access. The other is, I have the authority, but I'm told not to, as an example. Okay, two-factor authentication. Remember we talked about how, name and password is actually pretty doggone poor, and a lot of companies are requiring two-factor authentication, something that you have and something that you know. And so if you can remember that part, you'll be in good shape. Public key infrastructure. I'm not going to go into the details of, the public key and the private key and all the rest of that junk, and how do you do that? But I'm going to ask you a fundamental question about what parts are required to make this thing happen, and why. Why do I need this particular part, or why do I need this part, and why do I need that? Kind of a philosophical question, but if you can answer that, I think you'd be in good shape. We talked about how security certificates are used on websites. Remember that? How you have secure socket layers, and you can have that little HTTPS guy out there, and you may have a little gold padlock, or in some other browsers, the entire address bar turns gold. But anyway, some sort of an indication to let you know that you're onto a website that is secure. So I might ask you some questions about what does that tell me. In other words, if I have a secure connection, what is that? What several things it's going to tell me. Is it this? Is it this? Is it this? I'm going to ask you some questions regarding that. Backup options. I kind of went off on a wild tangent on that one as well. I talked all stories about disaster recovery and backup options and on and on and on. Expanded on that well beyond what was in the textbook. So I'm going to ask you some questions about, for example, what are the options for doing backups? And I'm not going to go into details of differential versus incremental. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about choices, offline, things of that nature. Okay. The next one is disaster recovery plan. I really believe in disaster recovery plans. You could probably tell by how much I emphasized it in the lecture. So I'm going to ask you some questions like, what would be a valid parts of a disaster recovery plan? I went down the list. Boom, 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 boom. All the things we talked about in lecture. In the textbook, they have like one sentence that covers that entire topic. And of course, I talked about it for 5 minutes on lecture, so pay attention. The next one talks about, internet cafe. So I go to Starbucks or some other, kind of a place where they have an open Wi-Fi system. What kind of problems may I have? What kind of safeguards should I use? What should I do and not do, as an example? And then a little bit further, they talk about kind of the same kind of a scenario, but like pretend like you're at a conference someplace, and it's not an open wireless system. It's closed, but they just posted the wireless password up on the screen for everyone to see. So how different is that from a Starbucks example? Am I safer? Am I not safer? What precautions should I use? What things should I do? What things should I not do? Things of that nature. Okay. The next one talks about internet cookies. What are they? Are they inherently evil? Do we have to have villagers with pitchforks and torques come storm the castle? I mean, are they evil, or are they kind of sort of benign? So do you turn off cookies everywhere, or do you not? Things of that nature. Social engineering is probably one of the easiest ways to get into a system. I mentioned the story about putting on a hard hat and looking like you belong, and you can make it right on in to any server room practically anywhere because you look like you belong. So social engineering is all about convincing people that you're legit and to divulge information or provide access. So I'm gonna give you a scenario and ask you, is that or is that not social engineering? Internet filters. We talked about how companies will limit, for example, don't want their employees going out looking at porn, or they don't want them streaming audio. And there's some legitimate reasons for doing that. Some of them are kind of draconian about, I don't want you watching porn. And others are for real, honest-to-God, legitimate business needs. If you can remember that, you'll be in good shape to go here. Now, the two extra credit questions are going to be slightly different. I remember I cautioned you for example, when you have a short answer kind of question, you can only write me a couple sentences, right? Because as long as I can figure out what the heck if I can figure out what the hell you're talking about, then that's good enough. You don't have to write me a huge thing. Now, with the extra credit, I do want you to write me 3 or 4 sentences, not just 1 or 2, because I want to dig deeper. So the extra credit questions are a little bit more wordy, and we're going to be talking about my backup philosophy. I gave you a philosophical statement. If you can remember that entire discussion, you'd be okay. That discussion took place over a period of about 5 or 6 minutes. I mean, I talked about it, and then I embellished it, and then I embellished it again, and I embellished it again. So it's several places in there where I talked about my backup philosophy. So if you can remember that, you'd be in good shape. The next one talks about mobile app pricing, and we had a brief discussion about how the introduction of mobile apps, starting with the iPhone, has really wreaked havoc with the rest of the software industry. And if you can give me a little bit about that, I think you're in good shape. Okay, so that's it. Now, once again, these are just some potential topics that may or may not show up on the exam. Help you study. These are not the questions. I didn't give you any of the questions, I don't think. So go over the videos. Take notes while you're doing videos. Look over your notes. Have the book handy. Have your notes handy. I doubt you'll have enough time to stop the test and go pull up a video. I mean, I don't think you got that kind of time. So take a lot of notes, and then have your book handy, and then run on through it. And I think you'll be in good shape. Okay, So that's it for this video. I guess we'll see you guys again for a normal video coming up next.